All right, so welcome to week 6. The latest posting on our website is the first homework. So we finally got to do the homework for the semester project, and so let's take a look at that. Listed under Submit Homework. There are basically two parts to this. One is just a questionnaire HTML form, which we want to fill out and submit everything. So that's one. And the second thing is that we will be working on some UML diagrams, perhaps one UML diagram for use cases related to the semester project challenge will be required. So you can upload it here, and I'm just letting you know that you can upload something that can be instantly viewable. I don't want to use any tools. I want to have essentially look at a picture file or a PDF file or something like that that I can immediately open. So just keep that in mind, because it would be not possible for me to load all kinds of designs, UML design software, and use that. Just use something that I can view. Okay, so I just practiced a little bit with entering the information in this assignment 1. So in this assignment 1, the challenge is that I want you to specify all the team members who are working on in your team. Then maybe you can choose the nickname. You can choose the project name, nickname for that. That usually goes pretty well with the rest of the group. System overview. Obviously, you can use parts that are listed in our semester project requirements model. You should be thoroughly analyzing this already multiple times and going over this description of what we have. So just this is something that we want to keep focused on. So obviously in realistic life, so these are just like something I copied and pasted off of the semester project requirements document. So don't pay attention to this. I'm just giving you an example that you need to provide information in these fields. So normally you would be developing like a Word document, some sort of word processing document to produce, but here to facilitate everything, I am giving you essentially the outline of these questions, and so you can provide this information. So the business goals, what type of users, just essentially there's all kinds of questions about this business requirement model that I want you to think about and provide the information. This can be just like 1-2 paragraph, just a few sentences, nothing big. This is important, glossary of terms. I want you to think about any kind of acronyms, abbreviations, or concepts present in that specific handout we have for business requirements, and essentially list everything. So I gave you just a couple of examples because your customers may not know that Java is a programming language, right? So they may not know what programming languages or technologies you use. So if you use any kind of abbreviations, you may want to specify it in the glossary of terms. And internally you can be using some glossary of terms, and that can be not necessarily technology-related glossary of terms. This can be user vocabulary. So sometimes you may forget the terms used by the user in your user domain, and you want to be able to, essentially use it effectively in your own language. So glossary of terms is basically a bridge between you, the programmer, and the user who is going to be benefiting from your software, right? So just keep that in mind. It would be just think about this glossary of terms. What would you like to include on that list? I would say that easily 10, 15, 20 terms could be put in there. Just think about it. Use case documentation, this is where we say that this is truly a functional specification. That's where the functional specification of the system begins. And I told you that collection of all use cases, and use cases are essentially instances of users interacting with the system, accomplishing certain goals, right? So collection of all use cases constitute functional specification, or in other terms, a document that describes what the system will be able to do. Okay, so typically when I think about my initial understanding of use cases, is that I find this very effective to use this format. Something that looks like this. The user, let me switch over to this font. The user does, and you describe what the user does. The system, the system responds, right? And you describe what the system does, right? So essentially, this kind of, this is what I try to, this is what I like to do when I write my notes on paper. Essentially, use this again. The user does something else, right? The system again responds or displays or shows information in such and such format, right? The user clicks a submit button, right? The system displays the confirmation box. And this type of kind of interaction between the user and the system, I find this to be very effective approach to put on track this type of interaction between the expert user and the developers who supposed to implement this, and this is just very effective way of describing the interaction within the use case and initial iteration of understanding of each use case. What we have here is I just used a format for something I call fully dressed use case format. And what I do here is that first of all, I'm letting you to basically use maybe pick 5 to 10 use cases, but then they need to be very thoroughly described. Sometimes people go with more than 5, 10, and it's very natural with the semester project, the amount of work there, it's very easy to go up to 20 different use cases if you think about different scenarios, different types of actors that could be using the system. Okay, so ultimately you have to document each use case. The rest of this document is simply a list of these boxes where you provide the description of the use case, which is just a short description, one line. Okay, who are the actors? Sometimes there could be multiple actors, right? And so let's use some sort of example of this. We can say create scenario. Create elevator traffic scenario. Let's be descriptive over here, right? So then the actors will be an operator. I don't know who is the operator. Perhaps I decide to name one of my actors an operator, and there could be also somebody who designed a scenario, a designer, scenario designer. Just to give you an idea, right? Now, don't copy any of the information I'm trying to put in here. This is just like, I'm not really thinking about the system. I'm just giving you the format, right? So sometimes there could be multiple actors. Preconditions, right? I don't know, the user which is kind of silly. The user must be logged in and have permissions to edit and save a scenario, a simulation scenario, right? Something like that, right? So most of the use cases, or many use cases, won't have any preconditions. I'm just giving you an example of a possible precondition that you may be thinking about. If you think about, and by the way, this will be very likely a work in progress, right? So very likely this is not going to be like in one shot you got everything right. It's perfectly normal. This is a work in progress. So you may change your mind about certain things. You may decide to merge some use cases. You may decide to split some use cases into more than one use case, and so forth, right? The main use case scenario describe all steps. This is where essentially this idea begins to visualize itself. What the user does, what the system does. What the user does, what the system, how the system responds, right? So this is where we begin to document this. And when I say main use case scenario, that represents like the most, essentially the mandatory steps, the steps that are always happening. But sometimes you can have exceptions and extensions. More about this later on. Essentially, the use case here can have alternative paths or optional things which may be happening. For instance, it's hard for me to think about this create elevator traffic scenario. It seems to be pretty straightforward. They just have to fill out the information. But perhaps we can say that if fields, if input fields for the number of visitors and or number of elevators in use are left unspecified, the system will use the default values from global scenario configuration and warns the user about this decision or whatever decision to use the defaults, right? So this may be incomplete, but gives you an idea that sometimes, let me scroll this up so that you can see what my thinking here goes, that usually there is some kind of condition or event that essentially kicks in, which sometimes may not take place, but if it does take place, we specify the alternative. And you can provide multiple alternatives over here, right? So you can provide other alternatives in this specific field. So more about this later on when we actually go and try to work through the requirement documents. I'm sure you have much more ideas. But main use case scenario, like I said, basically you can start with this format, right? So it doesn't have to look like a letter like this when you write it up. Essentially, use case is just writing information like a short story, right? Like a fictional story that describes what happens, who does what, but provides enough technical information for us to understand that, yes, we can rely on this information to actually start doing the programming. Just like we can have preconditions, the postconditions may be that, the scenario is saved and becomes available for approval by the operations manager, right? So I'm just inventing things, right? So who is the operations manager? I don't know, right? Maybe we have an actor like this, but perhaps before this scenario can become available to users to get on and start running that scenario and analyze it and so forth, perhaps it needs some sort of approval, right? So the post condition is that it's saved and becomes available for approval. So if we have an actor who will be getting in and reviewing the list of approvals that needs to take place, they will be able to see it on their screen, something like that. Okay, just to give you an idea, priority, you can use just numbers like 1 or 2 or 3 and so forth. Usually the lower number indicates the higher priority, but you can just basically say that this is high because it's very unlikely that if I do not enter or if I have no use case which allows me to use to create scenarios for my simulation, then it's very unlikely that I will be able to effectively use the rest of the system. So clearly this has to be marked as high-level scenario, right? So something like this, and then finally, each use case typically gets a unique identifier, and this is something I already tried doing when I was testing the screen, so there's some kind of designation left here. It can be just simply, you can just use numeric, combination of alphabetical and numeric. Usually you want to keep this short, and when I write code, I usually somewhere in the comments in my Java file or C++ file or C file or HTML web page, somewhere I put a comment indicating that this specific file or function or class implements such and such use case, right? So this is part of that use case implementation, because naturally there will be many classes participating in use case implementation eventually when we write implementation, but at this point basically we just want to provide some unique use case IDs which we can eventually use as references in our code to refer back to specific use cases. So if someone has to continue working on the stuff that we left off, they will be able to actually jump back to this place in the documentation and then get going and basically use this use case ID to locate the proper use case and read the description and continue working with it. So this is just a very quick overview of what I'm asking you to do here, and the rest of it is just simply just the same format for these use cases. I want you to think about and document them. Right, and document them by submitting this form. Just be sure that you can save your changes as often as you want. Just basically click Save Changes. It comes back, and once you do that, it saves your changes. So now my information here is saved. Right, so I just using my own screen name to provide you the example here. And once you are ready, you can just basically say submit for grading. If you are still want to work on it, just get out of it. If not, then you can submit for grading, and I will get your submission. Now, regarding the authors, let me actually save this segment and then we'll move on.